Welcome to the Being Human UT podcast, where Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus will discuss issues relative to the humanities and technology at Utah Tech University. And now your hosts for Being Human UT podcast, Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus.
Hello, this is Randy Jasmine, and welcome to the 30th episode of the Being Human UT podcast. I'm here with my partner, Jim Hindigus. And Jim, this is kind of a sad but perhaps hopeful day because we're saying goodbye.
Yeah,
Maybe.
Yeah, we're gonna talk through that a little bit. I think we're gonna say goodbye to a couple things that we know are coming to a close, but I also think there might be a new beginning from the ashes.
Yeah. I mean, just sitting here and getting ready for this episode, we've been talking about other potential ideas that could maybe be offshoots of this podcast that we've done since February of 2022. Like I said, 30 episodes, and being the academics that we are, we pretend as if the summer months don't really count in the regular calendar year because we're off doing whatever we do when we're not being professors. So we weren't a January to December podcast, and we weren't even a podcast that had an episode every month of the academic year, but we certainly kind of followed an academic schedule, and it's been 4+ years, 30 episodes, a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on. What are some of the things that kind of pop into your mind when we say, hey, let's look back on what we've done with this podcast?
What comes to my mind immediately is AI. I mean, I think our podcast changed completely with AI. I mean, as I recall, we started this podcast really processing the Polytechnic mission. We actually, correct me if I'm wrong, we started this podcast at Dixie State University.
We did.
And we ended it with Utah Tech. And so there was a start to the name, which involved tech, but also a very solid Polytechnic mission. And so that was what we were going to explore. And then once AI came to the scene, it kind of just took over. And we did address a lot of different topics, but AI seemed to creep into almost every one of our topics.
Yeah, there were few to no conversations that didn't have some connection to AI in it. Yeah. I mean, by the fall of 2022. So, like I said, we had a couple episodes in the spring. We started the first one in February of 2022. We had a couple of episodes in the spring, but by the fall of 2022, and I remember this pretty distinctly, we had our friend, computer science professor Curtis Larson on, and we wanted to talk to him about AI. And I remember kind of having to bone up a little bit on, okay, if we're talking about AI, what exactly are we talking about? And if I remember correctly, we weren't really talking primarily about ChatGPT, but by the time that new year rolled around, by the time 2023 rolled around, everybody knew about AI, but in particular, everybody knew about ChatGPT and the other more common forms of AI. And I think that speaks to, the temporal moment that we were in. Yes, we were moving from Dixie State University to Utah Tech. We interviewed the president of the university, and not long after that actual change had taken place. But we were also kind of bridging that moment to where, we were thinking about our concerns with technology and the humanities, but then everything got reshaped and redefined by the emergence of AI.
Yeah. I think another topic that also impacted a lot of topics was just teaching in general. We talked about the changing landscape of teaching. And yes, AI was a common theme with that change, but also, I mean, just the consistent, not just digitization of the classroom, but the technologies that are constantly impacting our classrooms and we're asked to work with. I mean, I know I remember I enjoyed that podcast we had where we had multiple graduate students talking about Canvas, and we have talked about Canvas on several episodes, and this idea that the traditional classroom that you and I both experienced, whether it was K through 12 or whether it was through college, it just doesn't exist. That the university is in a different technological space, and it's not. It is not going backwards anytime soon. It's going even more. I think we're talking off the air a lot about how the classroom's changing even more. That we're the focus that we have for our classrooms and how technology impacts our students is something we're constantly adapting to.
Yeah. We just can't teach. We can't instruct in students the same way that we used to, and I think that's something that's very significant. And I also think, and maybe another good reason to, end this particular manifestation of the podcast, and perhaps maybe, bring back something else that's connected to it, but to say stop here is because I think we've kind of reached the moment where all that uncertainty, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but the one thing that seems more certain now, or the one thing that seems to exist now that didn't exist back in, the start of 2023 and the years that followed, is we know we need to have a plan. And I know in the English department, we've got some folks who've been working very hard and very diligently on a policy, an AI policy for our department that professors can use to be guided, because I think we've come to the moment where we can no longer say, well, let's just keep using it and let's just see what happens. None of us really know anything about it, or I shouldn't say anything. None of us really know everything about it, but let's just see what happens. I think we've seen that the commercial motivation behind this, the commercial momentum behind this is at least finally starting to be questioned. That this idea that the inevitability of it is starting to be questioned. And there are people like you and I who are saying, hey, yes, we know we have to deal with this and we have to live with this, but we're going to come up with some very clear and very definite policies. My biggest kind of an overview of what I've kind of morphed into is every single assignment now, every assignment that I give my students is tagged as red light, green light, red light, yellow light, green light as far as AI is concerned. Assignments where you just absolutely cannot use it, assignments where if you feel you would benefit from it, you could use it, and then assignments where I encourage students to use it. And so, but along with that, there are very firm and clear guidelines as to, for example, what will be the consequences if a student uses it on a red light assignment. So in both a larger professional way, but also in a personal way as far as my instruction, I've changed over the time period that we've been doing this podcast.
Yeah. And it's becoming, it feels like it's becoming a lot more real, especially this year. Of these are the students that are seasoned, and they're more seasoned in their understanding of AI, and it's either ingrained in them or that we fully understand that this is a big task to tackle in the classroom. I feel like we as instructors, maybe you're finally coming to terms with the fact that we really don't know how to deal with this beast. We think that we do, or we were really excited about how AI, its possibilities, or we were really negative about it, and we were just saying, oh, it's the worst thing ever. But in reality, how do we actually teach with AI on a regular basis? It's becoming very real, and I think it's helping us to get back to what is it that we actually want to do as instructors for our students, and what are the core elements of to impart in them. And for me, I just go back to I want to help them learn, and unfortunately, I think in certain circumstances, AI helps people avoid learning. In some in some circumstances, it helps them improve their learning, but they have to be guided in their usage of it. Because I think, if I'm not looking at students as nefarious, I'm looking at them as just unaware. They don't know how to use it correctly.
Right.
I don't know if we want to shift away from this, but one thing I did want to mention that we've had on this podcast, and also a reason why we might be pivoting away, is that our dean is retiring. And,
Indeed.
And he graciously gave us access to speakers that he brought to campus. And so we've had some great authors and speakers on our podcast that he has sort of facilitated that interview. I don't know, with the new dean, I don't know what their new priority is, if they're going to continue or have that opportunity. And so, some of the guest speakers that we've had in the past that might have a different direction. So that was interesting to interview people that in the field, some amazing speakers that have either sat down with us. Most of them were on Zoom, but some of them sat down with us and talked with us. Those were great experiences, and I'm thankful for them.
Yeah, and it makes me think back that a lot of the messages from almost all of our speakers are, there is this sweet spot between humanities and technology that we can really take advantage of. And thinking back, also thinking of if I'm looking retrospectively, how have I changed as an instructor over the last 4 or 5 years? Also, have we taken advantages of those sweet spots between humanities and technology? And I think we've had some successes, but I think, there are still places where we can improve. And I mentioned this off air, and I told you I was going to mention it on air. One of our initial meetings with Dean Stephen Lee, who's been very supportive of us all through, was, he got very excited about it and, talked about the power of podcasts and how there's so many popular podcasts out there, and even brought up, Dolly Parton's America. And, even at that moment, as we were leaving that meeting, I remember saying to you, that's a high bar that he's set for us. And, unfortunately, we never really came close to hitting the bar of a podcast like that, at least in terms of numbers of listens, right? It's been great fun, but in some ways it hasn't always been perhaps as big a podcast as might have been envisioned initially.
We tried.
We did. And
I don't know if that was a realistic bar that we were going to, reach, but at the same time, I mean, we did aspire. We tried to do him proud.
Indeed. So it's been a good run, and like you say, I like this idea of perhaps leaving it open-ended and thinking maybe this isn't the end. Maybe there's a way that we can channel this in another direction. Mm-hmm. But in terms of this particular podcast, moments that you kind of remember in your mind, whether they be for the quality of the discussion that we had, or just kind of humorous moments, things that you remember most about the podcast. Most of them have been here in this studio, but our first couple were over in the Holland building with the portable equipment that the English department has. And then we did a couple on location podcasts from the Polytechnic Conference, from the Digital Humanities Utah Conference. What are some of the things you remember most about this podcast?
One of the observations that I made that I thought was the most interesting from this side of the mic was that, we had 3 types of podcast. I thought there was just you and me. There were a couple that was just you and me, and we're talking just like this. We had a few, like I'd mentioned, that were interviews with people that we didn't know very well. And so we were just...
Scott Hartley, Adam Dorr.
Yeah. Those people that we just brought on as an interview. And then there were people that we've worked with that are within our college. And, one of my observations was, in this different forum, in the podcast forum, I saw people who are seasoned teachers that were just a little bit nervous, that were, not, I wouldn't say uncomfortable, but they were that feeling that those students that don't do presentations very often will have those nerves. And I saw that in sometimes our colleagues, which I thought was very refreshing to put them in a situation that was new for them. And but it was also very exciting, just like when we finally sit down with someone we know and we see them do their job. I don't know if you've ever had that situation where you have a friend and you finally join them at work and you see what they do and you're like, oh wow, like you're really professional. I've only seen you, playing video games at my house. And so it was really refreshing to see certain people in their professional environment. I think about interviews that we had like with Joy McMurran, with Mike Peterson, people that we work with within our own department, that I was able to see, this is them kind of with the spotlight on them. And it reminded me that I don't do that enough, that I don't see those people presenting. I don't go to the conferences that they go to when they present on their materials. I just kind of wave to them when they're in the hallway. So, I mean, that was one opportunity. I was able to, sit down for a little under an hour with people I work with and actually hear about what they're doing. That was, on a selfish note, was refreshing. Even, people within our college, I think about when we sat down with Sharik, that was really fascinating. Just many people that we worked with in this university, that it was wonderful to have the opportunity to sit down and listen to what they were saying. If we talk about technology, how often do we get the opportunity to talk with somebody with mics in front of us and we're not sitting there just, checking our Canvas course or have our cell phone in front of us.
Right.
And go, that one scene I always think about with, I hope I didn't mention this story before, but I always think about this with radio. I think it was Wayne's World, when Harry Shearer, where he's just like, and he's just doing something, and I won't repeat necessarily what Wayne was saying to get him to reveal that he wasn't listening. But I mean, there's so much in our lives that we're distracted from listening to people. This space forced us to listen to people. It was great.
Yeah, and if you did tell that story before, then I'm obliged to tell you my reaction and say that again. That skit actually appeared many years before Wayne's World on Saturday Night Live, with Harry Shearer as in the role of the DJ, and Howard Hessman, who at the time was starring as a DJ on WKRP in Cincinnati. And he was doing the exact same thing, where he had promised him he was going to pay attention and ask him these questions, and just had no intention of listening to anything he said. And so, of course, Howard Hessman just started saying the most shocking and unbelievably crazy things. And yep, it wasn't a real conversation. And I just feel like we did have real conversations. And even you and I think you and I, and the funny thing is, we've taught podcasts. We've assigned podcasts to our students and had them create them. I think in the early days, you and I were maybe a little bit more stilted, a little bit more formal, a little bit more uncomfortable than we eventually turned out to be. And it really took a little while for us to get used to it. So I'm really grateful to those guests who, got over that nervousness pretty quickly. And I would say the vast majority of time that we were producing content, we were having conversations rather than just, people saying something that they, and being nervous about saying it. That's my read anyway.
Yeah, and I enjoyed that format. I mean, sometimes it made me realize when we're asked to, we ask colleagues or students or anybody to do a presentation, you got 5 to 10 minutes to present they're in presentation mode, but this was always conversation mode. Sometimes people would give their sort of, I don't want to say rehearsed, but their pre-rehearsed speech,
their talking
points early on, but then eventually it became a conversation. We were able to ask them some questions, and it did. I think it improved us in our skills of asking questions and getting at some really key points in the conversation, as opposed to just making it a bullet pointed list. Many of these conversations, you couldn't plan what would take the most time out of that conversation. It was very organic, and I appreciated that. Early on for me, and we put together questions for the people that we were interviewing, and then you just sort of worked from there. It was kind of exciting to be able to see, all right, well, they already answered that question, so I would just cross it out, or move to another question, or have just a conversation that was sort of planned, or so that there wasn't dead air, and that's a skill that we both developed, and that was a learning experience I really enjoyed.
Yeah, definitely. And as we've alluded to, there's some things that we've been thinking about in terms of possible new channels we can take with this. And, Jim, you mentioned this idea of, okay, not as big a change as the entire university changing its name, but we have this merger coming up between the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the College of the Arts. And it might be interesting to look into what that merger is all about, and how in this ever-increasing world, we're never going to be able to completely escape the influence of technology, but in this ever-increasingly technological world, what does it mean to be a professor, a teacher of the humanities, of the arts, of social sciences, and maybe take a little bit more interior focus on those who are all around us. I mean, with CHAS, it's easier now than it ever was, right? Because we're now all in the same building.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we look at coming together with the College of the Arts.
Yeah, I think it would be fun. And so that's one of the thoughts that we were having, and that's what I'm leaning towards, is that we invite people who we are merging with in these colleges, and I'm fascinated to talk to people in these different fields that I don't interact with. I mean, it's fascinating enough to interact with people in communications and psychology and all the different aspects of CHAS, of our own college. Now we're bringing in more people. It's almost like meet your new members of your family. It's like a Brady Bunch. If we keep going, man, we're old.
Or when the branches merge on The Office.
Yes.
We're bringing in the people from Stanford.
Yeah. But that's kind of exciting to me, because one of a relief in kind of wrapping up this chapter is it felt like a lot to process with Polytechnic, with changing technology, with all the subjects that we're tackling. Now maybe we're going to retreat a little bit more inward and say, well, what's it like to be this merger of this college? What's it like to be thinking about teaching methods within our own college? And we have the opportunity, if we're gonna embrace another university aspect, something that's been talked about for a very, very long time, is this concept of active learning.
Right.
This concept of, and we have the opportunity with this college to be very focused on active teaching because of just the subject matter that we're covering. So, yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. We're not going to be on record.
Not going to limit ourselves to anything at all at this point, but certainly things to think about. And certainly it wouldn't be complete as we're finishing up and thanking people if we didn't mention, and we mentioned this off air as well, and we don't know if he's going to want to jump in and say anything to the listeners, but Sean Denovan, who's made this podcast possible and
You're welcome.
Even when we're not in the studio and we're doing things remotely, we would send our files to him and he would take care of everything. And just really, we don't talk about it. We maybe never talked about it, but it just gives this podcast such a professional look and feel. And that's really so important. And that's all down to Sean. So we just wanted to make sure that we thanked you for that specifically. And, like I said, it's kind of a bittersweet day, saying goodbye, but maybe, it's not the end.
So, yeah, just thank you, Sean. And I thankful for those who have listened to these episodes. We have gone on our own journey, and I think this is, a good stopping point for this type of journey, but we're probably willing to go on another journey. We'll see if we're going to use the same branding or not.
TBD.
Yes. So,
well, thank you everyone for listening to the 30th and final episode of Being Human UT. For my colleague and friend, Dr. Jim Hendigas, this is Randy Jasmine saying so long and hope to see you sometime in the future.
This has been the Being Human UT podcast with Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas. Please follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. From Utah Tech University, this is the Being Human UT podcast. This has been a production from A Podcast Studio.